X-Men First Class Movie Review. So this is one of my scripted movie review series in which I take a movie review that I wrote years ago on my weblog and try and film it, make a YouTube video out of it for whatever that may or may not be worth. Which is why I'm talking about X-Men First Class, a movie that came out 9 years ago, all the way back in 2011. Actually, come to that, I've never really talked about any of the X-Men movies on this channel. Well, I talked about Logan, if Logan counts. But I never talked about any of the rest of them. The reason being, of course, that all the early ones came out long before I started this YouTube channel, and before I was even reviewing movies on my weblog. So the first movie, X-Men, came out in 2000. X2 came out in 2003. And XMen III came out in 2006. By 2006, I did actually have a weblog up and running, but I wasn't yet in the habit of reviewing every movie I saw. So those three movies I never gave a movie review to. But I can give you some thoughts right now, and maybe this will help set the context for my review of X-Men First Class. Actually, maybe I can back up even one step further and talk about my thoughts on the X-Men as a whole. I was very aware of them, as every kid in the 1990s was. I mean, everybody knew who the X-Men were, definitely. I was never a huge fan. I was more of a DC Comics person in my youth. But to the extent I knew about them, I was intrigued. You know, that Saturday morning cartoon with that cool music gave the X-Men an air of mystery, and it seemed to be very intriguing. I never really got into them, but I was always quasi-interested in them. At the same time, they were like super popular in the 90s, and they were everywhere, and there's a whole bunch of comic books that got mass-produced, and this was during like the big kind of comic explosion in the 1990s when they were making way too much stuff for collectors. So there was a little bit kind of nausea at X-Men being everywhere. So I was kind of intrigued by them and kind of a little sick of them by the end of the 1990s. The movie came out in 2000, and I saw it, and it was okay. It was not great. There were some interesting things set up in the first movie, which paid off much better in the second movie. But Magneto as a complex villain with an interesting history, somebody who's not just evil for the sake of being evil, but has a backstory that explains his motivations, is somewhat still a comic book villain in the fact that all his kind of plans are overly simplistic. But in the tradition of maybe Marvel villains especially, he does have a point of view, which is not just simply being evil for the point of evil, but he's got something he wants to accomplish, which he thinks will be for the greater good, which by the standards of comic book movies, I think makes him decently complex. Patrick Stewart did a great job as Professor X. There was all a great cast there. I mean, I'm blanking on everybody's names now, but there was a solid cast there. That final confrontation in the X-Men movie, the first one, was pretty cliche and nothing special, and I think that gave me kind of a meh feeling about it. X-Men II, though, that really blew me out of the water. And it blew me out of the water especially because I was not expecting it to be as good as it was after feeling that X-Men I was just kind of meh. But X-Men II really hooked me. I got hooked in the drama, I got hooked in the personality conflicts. I like that they took stuff they had set up in the first movie and just expanded the conflicts. After X-Men II, I was invested in this franchise. Like, I was really interested to see where they went from there. X-Men III, I know everybody hates this movie, but I liked it when I saw it in theaters. I don't know, maybe if I rewatched it now, I wouldn't like it quite as much. But I remember feeling when I saw it in theaters that it was dramatic and it was a good, exciting thrill ride. I think X-Men III has gone through some stages in terms of public reception. I think initially people who saw it in the theaters reacted positively to it, or I think initially it was rather well received. Then came the backlash, and then I think maybe we're at the stage now where people are reevaluating it and saying actually it wasn't nearly as bad as everyone said it was. All of those movie reviews take with a grain of salt, because I haven't seen any of those movies in years, and if I rewatch them now, I don't know how my opinion would reevaluate, or who knows how I'm misremembering them, etc. But that brings us to X-Men First Class. Now, like I said, by the time this movie came around, I considered myself invested in the series. This movie was supposed to be a prequel to the X-Men movies. And I say that because I think we're at the point now where it's not entirely sure what this movie was. Because the continuity of the X-Men movies just makes no sense at this point. Unless maybe you accept this movie as a reboot and maybe ignore Days of Future Past, which was trying to act as a bridge between the old and new franchise, but makes less and less sense with each new movie that comes out. So, yeah, initially it was perceived, it was marketed and perceived as a prequel to the X-Men movies. I think now we have to count it as a reboot. That being said, because I'm rereading my old review from 2011, I'm going to treat it maybe like a prequel, because that's the way it was perceived back then, and that's the old review I'm going off of. Actually, speaking of which, since I started out in that vein, as a prequel, I think this works relatively well. Again, now that all the other movies have come out, the continuity is a mess. But back when only this movie came out, it seemed to work well within the world that the other X-Men movies had set up. There are all sorts of things you can nitpick, and there are some people who are much better at this than I am, who have gone through and nitpicked every character change they could find between the first three X-Men movies and this X-Men movie, and I'll link to a couple of those in the description below. The big thing that jumped out of me, two big things that jumped out of me as a continuity error, possibly, was the relationship, excuse me, the relationship between Professor Xavier and Magneto. The first three X-Men movies, we got the sense that there was some sort of long friendship that these two have had, some sort of backstory that was only hinted at, but some sort of deep friendship. And the danger of doing prequels is a lot of things like this, it's much better to leave up to the imagination, because whatever the filmmakers can put down on film is not maybe quite as in-depth or as interesting as just this vague backstory that was hinted at. Because now that we actually have to see their friendship develop in real time, it's not quite as strong as we had been led to believe. I mean, they seem to have a mutual respect for each other. They're friends in this movie for several months before they have a falling out. But yeah, you know, you got the impression from the previous X-Men movies that there had been this deep friendship that had developed over many years, not that they had just teamed up for a few months before almost immediately falling out with each other. So that basis for the deep friendship between Professor Xavier and Magneto was not in this movie. On the other hand, the character that Charles Xavier really does have the deep relationship with is Mystique. And boy, was that not set up at all in those first 3 X-Men movies, when Professor Xavier and Mystique just did not have any interest in each other at all. So that's one glaring continuity error right off the bat, which makes this movie hard to fit into the other 3 X-Men movies. And again, with each subsequent X-Men movie that got released after this, the continuity would get even more and more tortured. That being said, though, I really like this movie. I thought the plot was a little bit convoluted at first, as 3 separate storylines had to be converged into one. But, you know, I like a complex plot. I like a movie that keeps me on my toes and makes me pay attention. So, no problem there. I thought the movie did a really good job of creating dramatic suspense, particularly in the beginning. There's 1 or maybe 2 scenes near the big opening of the movie that does a really good job of milking the suspense to build up to the dramatic climax. There's a few different scenes like that at the beginning. I guess I'm thinking like right at the very beginning, where Kevin Bacon's Nazi character is finding Magneto's powers. And also when Magneto is an Argentino confronting those Nazis. Both of those scenes, I thought, did a very good job of milking the dramatic tension. You know, the music kind of slowly building up to a crescendo. You knew something was going to happen, but you didn't know quite what, and it just really kept you in suspense the whole time. Actually, there was a few different scenes like that now that I think about it at the beginning. Really well done. The characters are engaging. Or at least the main characters are. Once they get the X-Men team together, there are several X-Men who are blatantly just there to kind of fill out the roster, who don't get developed at all. But all the main characters get decently developed into very interesting 3-dimensional characters. This film continues the theme established in the earlier X-Men movies, that a character's inner demons are just as much of a threat as their outside enemies. And we see a number of characters struggling with and sometimes giving into their inner demons. The acting is quite good as well. Admittedly, the 2 lead actors who play Professor X and Magneto respectively, James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender, have some very big shoes to fill, because Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen were great in these roles and they had great chemistry with each other. But James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender do an excellent job. So yeah, all in all, I thought it was a very good movie. Couple other random notes before I finish this review. One is on the 1960s setting. Now, I believe at the time this film came out, it was unique at the time to do a retro setting for a blockbuster summer superhero movie. Since then, I think there's been a couple more that's come out. I mean, Captain America, the First Avenger, went full-on retro with the 1940s. Maybe a couple more. But it was not the trend at the time. The trend at the time was to take these characters that had been in comics in the 1940s and 1960s and modernize them, bring them into the modern 21st century in the movies. This movie was going in the opposite direction. And I mean, I know the X-Men originally were from the 1960s. Okay, well, technically, the X-Men incarnation that we know of was from the 1980s, but the first X-Men comics were from the 1960s. Anyways, even though that's true, the X-Men movie franchise was from the 2000s. So that's what had been established in the public consciousness. So to take that modern franchise and then go retro with it was unusual. But it was unusual in a good way, because it was interesting, it was unique. So I thought that was an interesting aspect of this movie. That being said, I don't think they took full advantage of the retro setting they were in. And they totally could have. I mean, Mad Men, which was popular at the same time this movie came out, Mad Men really went through a lot of work to recreate authentic period detail. This movie felt like they only put in half the work. Every now and then a character will say daddy-o or groovy. Some of the clothing looks a bit retro-ish, but even here I'm not sure they were entirely period consistent. And I'm not an expert, so this is just going off of my feelings. But I feel like this movie took place during the Kennedy era, right? And I think the Kennedy era was mostly the same fashion and styles as the 1950s. It wasn't what we think of as the 1960s yet. This movie, though, seems to be mixing 1960s and maybe even early 1970s fashion in with that. I mean, it's all kind of vaguely retro, but I'm not sure they got the authentic period detail. I'm not sure anyone particularly cared because it was an X-Men movie, but, well, I cared. I thought it didn't ruin the movie, but it would have been cooler. It would have been so much cooler if they would have really gone all in and just, gone the Mad Men route and just made this, recreated the whole feeling of the 1960s. The haircuts as well, particularly on the young stars, didn't seem very 1960s at all to me, even early 1960s. And again, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, because I didn't live through that period. I'm not an expert per se, but certainly it was not the impression I got of what the Kennedy era haircuts looked like. I suspect what happened is marketing got involved with this, or somebody at the studio, I don't know. And they said, no, we've got to have marketable haircuts on all the young men that we're going to put on the posters for this movie. So you can't have them wearing haircuts that would have looked normal in 1961. I suspect that's what happened. Anyways, it didn't spoil the movie for me. It would have been cooler if it would have been more period authentic. Okay, last thing I want to talk briefly about is the Cuban Missile Crisis, which forms the plot of this movie. Cuban Missile Crisis is interesting. The version I learned in school, and let me know in the comments if your experience is similar. I suspect it was, at least for the Americans. The version I learned in school is that we Americans were just minding our own business, and then all of a sudden, the Russians put these missiles right into Cuba, and we didn't want this missile crisis, but then there it was, and we had to do something, and, Kennedy had to stand up to the Russians because they put these missiles in Cuba unprovoked. I didn't find out until I was in college that that was not the story at all, or that was not the complete story. The complete story is, before those missiles were in Cuba, the United States put missiles in Turkey. And Turkey was right on the USSR's border. And it was the missiles we had in the missiles that the US put in Turkey, which were pointed at Russia, were much closer to Russia, to the USSR, than the missiles that the USSR put in Cuba. And the Kennedy administration knew this, and they were in negotiations with the Russians. And Kennedy said, can you get rid of the missiles in Cuba? And the Russians said, sure. You just get rid of the missiles in Turkey first, which was completely reasonable because those missiles in Turkey were much more of a threat to them. They were much closer to them than the missiles in Cuba were. But Kennedy didn't want to do it because it would have looked like he was backing down to the Russians, backing down from the Russians, conceding to the Russians. It would have made him look weak, even though it was completely fair. And so because Kennedy didn't want to look weak, then we had this big crisis, and the world was, depending on who you ask, this close to being destroyed in a nuclear holocaust, just because Kennedy didn't want to look weak. So that's the real story of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Hardly is that real story told in the US. For example, there was that movie that came out, this is a while ago now, but came out in the 1990s, 13 Days, starring Kevin Costner, about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think they mentioned one line in that movie, that we also had missiles in Turkey. But otherwise they completely overlooked it. I don't think they barely mentioned that a diplomatic solution to that whole thing would have just been to remove our missiles from Turkey. So I had just kind of come to expect that anything from the mainstream media in the US would not acknowledge that we had missiles in Turkey first, and then those missiles in Turkey were a provocation. And then this X-Men movie goes out of its way to make it a big plot point that the US put their missiles in Turkey, and that's what kicked off the whole thing. It's a huge plot point of this movie. Now, in the world of the X-Men movies, it's evil mutants who are provoking the US into doing this, etc. But still, they make it front and center that the US kicked off the whole crisis by putting the missiles in Turkey. So I did not expect that. It's a little bit sad that we have to go to these X-Men movies for accurate historical portrayals, such as it is. But yeah, there you go. So they get points for that in my book. Okay, I'll finish the review here.